Now, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has warned that humanity has become a weapon of mass extinction as he opened the COP15 Biodiversity Summit in Canada. Delegates from nearly 200 countries will spend the next 2 weeks hashing out a new global deal to protect the world's struggling species and fast vanishing wild places. Mr. Guterres warned there was no time to lose and there was no plan B, as Arise Environment correspondent Laila Johnson Salami reports.
The United Nations Biodiversity Conference, COP15, has kicked off in Montreal, Canada, as representatives from 196 countries look to reach an agreement on biodiversity loss and what can be done to reverse it. In 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services warned that 1 million species face extinction, as 3/4 of the world's land surfaces and oceans have been significantly altered. And according to international NGO World Wildlife Fund, wildlife populations have plunged 69% in the last 50 years. The head of the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity, Elizabeth Mrema, is urging bold action to avoid irreversible damage to the planet's ecosystems.
Nature is as important as climate. And for climate to succeed, it means nature has to succeed, and that's why we have to deal with them together. So if that is not the message by itself, that we need to do something, we are already late. At least the scientists are telling us it's not too late, but we're about to reach the tipping points. So if action is not taken now, then we'll be at the tipping points and the situation will be irreversible.
Addressing the conference, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said humanity is treating nature like a toilet.
Ecosystems have become playthings of profit. With our bottomless appetite for unchecked and unequal economic growth, humanity has become a weapon of mass extinction. We are treating nature like a toilet, and ultimately, we are committing suicide by proxy.
The main goal of the conference is to conclude on a framework for biodiversity protection. A draft framework released last year includes 4 long-term goals for 2050 and 21 targets for member states to reach by 2030. These targets include protecting at least 30% of land and sea by 2030, managing pathways for the introduction of invasive alien species, and increasing financing to $200 billion a year. However, the draft includes several brackets as countries are yet to agree on a number of issues. Scientists and rights advocates have expressed concern, as none of the targets laid out in the last decade-long framework published in 2010 have been achieved.
Yeah, we can even go one step back. The target set under the convention for 2010 was not met. Then they set another 20 targets for 2020, and they have not been met. So looking ahead to 2030, what sort of deal are we going to get? What sort of framework? Well, the negotiations are quite fraught at the moment. There's a lot of disagreement amongst countries across most of the targets and the preambular text that surrounds the targets. So I think we will reach an agreement by the end of the conference, but the jury's still out as regards how ambitious it will be, whether it's adequately financed, and how we're going to ensure countries this time round comply with what they said they're going to do.
There are mixed opinions on whether a landmark deal on biodiversity protection will be achieved in Montreal, but it's certainly crunch time for a planet in crisis. A recently published UN report says financing for nature must more than double by 2025 to meet key climate and biodiversity goals. And with 50% of the global economy dependent on nature, scientists are calling for urgent action as fears of a 6th-era mass extinction grow. Laila Johnson Salami, Arise News.
And Arise Environment correspondent Laila Johnson Salami joins me now for more. Laila, good to see you. So attempts to address what's been described as a biodiversity crisis, as we saw in your report there, with an estimated 1 million species at risk of extinction. And obviously this has implications for all of us, doesn't it?
Certainly, Charles. You know, human pressure is driving extinction at an unprecedented rate. And there are several factors contributing to this, from land conversion to deforestation, to poaching and hunting of wild animals, pollution and climate change. But what's quite worrying is that ecologists say there are about 8.7 million species that human beings are pretty much contingent on to survive. And they provide us with this safety net for our survival, providing us with the resources we need, such as our food, water, clean energy, and air. And we are losing these species at a very rapid rate. So what's happening as well is that human safety net is shrinking. And because biodiversity is dependent on biodiversity itself to survive, this is very worrying. It's coming at rates, Charles, that haven't been seen before. So the conference that's going on right now in Montreal is a very important one. Delayed by 2 years, by the way. It was supposed to take place in 2020, but because of the pandemic, the dates had to change, and the location as well. It was supposed to take place in China, but quite worrying when you think about the fact that 1 million species currently face extinction, and there are 8.7 million species that we depend on for our survival as human beings.
Yes, and you made the important point there that since the last round of talks in 2010, they've failed on every count to meet targets. I mean, is this latest summit likely to be any different?
Good question. You know, there's no clear answer to this, but Charles, we have also seen a pattern when it comes to matters of the environment and setting targets for the environment, targets that just don't end up being met. We saw this recently at COP27, where there was a lot of debate on targets from the previous COP in Glasgow in 2021 that simply just haven't been met. So no one necessarily knows what the outcome is going to be yet, but we heard from John Scanlon there in that package that I put together. And he's currently the CEO of the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation, but he used to be the General Secretary of CITES. He was also present back then in 2010. And when I spoke to him, we had a lengthier conversation. And when I spoke to him, he said, you know, reaching an agreement is not necessarily the issue. It's how that agreement is implemented and the content of that agreement itself. And if we take a closer look at some of that content that's in the draft framework already, one of the targets is to protect 30% of the world's land and sea by the year 2030. Already we're seeing worry and criticisms coming towards this. Amnesty International, the international NGO, for example, came out to say that this is quite a worrying target, and it must take into consideration that it could drive widespread evictions, which could then lead to insecurity, violence, and other issues. So it's not that clear cut. Certainly, I'm sure we will probably see an agreement come out of this, but the content of that agreement is where the concern lies.
Well, absolutely. And just listening to you there, Laila, as well as your package, I mean, all this suggests that we need a sort of nature positive approach. And farming, from what I understand, is a big area, isn't it? I mean, how can agriculture help to sustain biodiversity, and what can be done to help farmers?
Certainly, Charles. You know, this is a very important issue that has to be discussed, and it is on the table in Montreal at the moment. You know, globally, we have to change the way that we go about agriculture. Our ancestors weren't clearing hectares and hectares of land just to plant one crop. What they did is they practiced agroforestry, which is when the forest and the farmland live together in one, and you don't have to cut down or get rid of biodiversity to, for example, put in several hectares of tomatoes for a tomato field, because what that does is if you have no biodiversity in your soil, it dries up the soil and it's not healthy for the ground. So you end up using chemicals, right, to make sure that your plants or your crops grow in this field that you've created for this one crop or two crops. But those chemicals are also harming the environment. They're harming the insects and the pollinators. So the cycle is a very vicious one at the moment. So these are issues that are going to be discussed. And Charles, you know, if we tie that into Nigeria, we can look at a controversial issue in Nigeria that's been going on with regards to the farmers' herders crisis, for example. and the debate around whether Nigeria should have ranches, so on and so forth. Now, even though that argument has been put forward, if you look at what the science actually says, ranching itself is not necessarily that good for the environment, and grazing actually helps to sustain the land. So these are issues that are going to be discussed because it's more complex than just agriculture. Several other issues tie into the agricultural aspect, like the example I've just given here in Nigeria, which of course ties in security and other issues too.
Very interesting indeed. So clearly a much broader societal shift needed. Laila, thank you very much indeed. Arise environment correspondent Laila Johnson Salami there.